Today on Straight Talk Africa, an in-depth discussion on the presidential elections in Malawi and South Africa. How much of an advantage do incumbent presidents have when they run for re-election? That's coming up next, right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I'm Vincent Makori in for Shekasali. Today we're discussing the power of the incumbency and if that was a factor in the recent elections in Malawi and South Africa. Now, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in last month, vowing to create jobs and tackle deep-rooted corruption that has stifled the nation's economic growth. In Malawi, incumbent Peter Mutharika took the presidential oath of office and allegiance after winning the country's election on May 21st. He has called on his opponents to accept the results. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
Ladies and gentlemen,
newly elected South African President Cyril Ramaphosa says he's committed to tackling severe challenges the country faced at his inauguration ceremony in Pretoria. Ramaphosa is South Africa's fifth president since the end of the apartheid regime in 1994. He is pledging to root out corruption while announcing a new leaner cabinet for South Africa. Half of those appointed are women, making the country the third on the African continent after Ethiopia and Rwanda to achieve gender parity among its ministers.
All South Africans are acutely aware of the great economic difficulties that our country is going through right now. But they are also aware of the constraints that have been placed on our public finances. It is therefore imperative that in all areas and spheres of government, we place priority on revitalizing our economy, while at the same time exercising great care in the use of public funds.
A South African political analyst says having a small cabinet is good for business and investment. He says it shows a sign of decisiveness and political stability.
The cabinet shows a certain level of dynamism. It's efficient. It's meant to bring in or elicit new ideas from people who are never there.
Ramaphosa's African National Congress won this year's election with 57% of the vote, down from 62% in 2014. Meanwhile, in Malawi, President Peter Mutharika was sworn in for a second term last Tuesday after a contentious election marred by allegations of fraud and vote rigging. Mutharika of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party won with 38% of the vote, defeating Lazarus Chokoza of the Malawi Congress Party, who had 35% of the ballot.
Thank you, Malawians, for re-electing me as your president for the next 5 years.
Malawi's opposition leader Lazarus Chokoza is rejecting the presidential election results. He says he has launched a court battle to have the vote annulled on the grounds of fraud. In a statement, Chokoza said, quote, "I reject the Malawi Electoral Commission's fraudulent presidential results." He goes on to say, "What we have witnessed in front of our eyes is not an election, but daylight robbery, a crime against our decency as a people and our democracy as a nation." Chokoza lost the election to Mutharika by just 159,000 votes. Mutharika was then sworn into office the day after the delayed results was issued. Third place presidential contender Saulus Chilema garnered 20% of the vote. Malawi has a winner-take-all system, and in 2014, Mutharika also narrowly beat Chokoza by a small margin. Mutharika came to power vowing to tackle corruption after the Cashgate scandal a year earlier revealed massive looting from state coffers. Political observers say Mutharika's administration has not been spared by the corruption scandal. Paul Ndiho, VOA News.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul, for that report. Joining us now for an in-depth discussion are our guests, Lazarus Chokoza, Malawian main opposition leader. He joins us live via Skype from Lilongwe. In the studio today, we hope to have very soon Paul Nantulia, researcher, National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., and Piwakunle Mnyandu, Department of African Studies at Howard University, also here in Washington. A warm welcome to both of you for now. Thank you. I want to go first to Malawi. Mr. Chokoza Lazarus, good evening to you.
Yes.
Yeah, first,
good evening.
Yes, you have rejected the results of the Malawian presidential election, and you've actually used some really tough words in your statement. Question is, are you a victim of the power of incumbency, or was there something else that you did not anticipate that happened at last minute, now that actually your loss was by a very slim margin?
Well, I have been, I guess, a victim of both. The incumbency as well as some very, very nefarious activities that were intended to tip this election in his favor. There is legitimacy sometimes in incumbency because of the fact that one is president, and that alone gives one a chance to really be before the people with a program of development that would actually campaign for yourself and the international network that you establish, and so that's legitimate. But when you have illegitimate use of power, which is an abuse of power, where the incumbency then begins to use or abuse state resources for one's advantage and the state broadcaster for solely one's advantage, and then you have a whole system that really disadvantages those in opposition, one can actually see how the incumbency then has an upper hand because the playing field has never been level.
And now,
but issues to do like with TPEX and so forth, now that is a surprise because the Electoral Commission says they never procured TPEX. But then they went ahead and said they had TPEX result sheets from across the country. So one wonders where that came from because they had assured us that no such thing would ever happen.
Very quickly, and we'll actually expound on all those things you've said. If I may stay with you for just a quick follow-up here. Going into the election as an opposition leader, are some of these things you anticipated? I mean, for example, you are very much aware of the advantages the incumbent has. Did you think you could expect a different result? Did you base your hope on just goodwill, or is there anything you thought you could do to make sure there is a fair and free election?
In fact, we did everything we could. We campaigned and crisscrossed the country telling people that we want a type of leadership that's different, and we want to unite the country. We want to make everybody have a share in Malawi's resources so we can all prosper together. We wanted to end corruption and then follow the rule of law. And this message was well received across the country. People wanted change, and we represented that change. And we were pretty much sure that despite the incumbency advantage, we were still going to win the election, and we did.
Well, coming to a studio here now, Nyando, South Africa also held an election not long ago, and ANC won. But again, it did not win as big as it would have hoped. The numbers went down. But in the case of South Africa, which has a totally different system, it has this proportionate representation.
Yes.
Did the incumbency play a part, as in the individual person who's the face of the party, or is this so much about the party itself?
I would say it's two things. It's both about the party itself, the ANC, and about the nature of the opposition parties. Their maturity, their readiness for high office, or their hard work, their grit, their party machinery. And these four factors can affect how much there will be the opposition parties will appeal to the people. From what we're seeing in the recently held elections, South African people are not as revolutionary as some might want them to be. They do not want immediate change in South Africa. They don't have an appetite for an immediate change or an immediate usurpation of the African National Congress's power. So by default, that favors the incumbency. The people's basically unwillingness to see a radical change, even when they see so many disincentives to voting for the ANC. A clear case in point is no sooner had the South African people put the ANC back into power, within 2 weeks there were protests for service delivery. So South African people, in one way, they want change, but they are not quite sure if they are ready for that change to come from elsewhere.
Now, Mr. Chokoza, you know, for example, you're in court now. You're trying, hopefully, to have this election result annulled. Question is,
yes,
given again that the incumbent has been sworn in, he's the president, what are the prospects of the court's ruling in favor of you and the rest of the opposition?
We have confidence in our judiciary because we believe that we have overwhelming evidence to show to the Malawian people through the courts that this election was truly a stolen election and it should not be upheld as legitimate.
Now, Dr. Mnyandu, some have looked at elections like those of South Africa, of course, and you know, closely looking at the issues, looking at the other parties, and you say there's a question of the different parties and the level of maturity and the willingness to be a little bit more revolutionary. But if you look across and look at how other elections are conducted, do you get the sense that perhaps the opposition goes into an election without demanding for certain basic thresholds that will guarantee a free and fair election, but surprisingly they kind of come back and get shocked by the outcome of the election, which for some observers it's an obvious result?
Well, there's a way some opposition parties in the Southern African region have historically tried to go around that problem. They basically vote with their feet and stay out of the election altogether. So that might sound kind of quite radical, but that's one way of dealing with it. The thing with democracy is that once you sign in to an election, you now, not only do you sign in to participate, but as a price for participation, or you must agree that you abide by the outcomes. Now, that's ceteris paribus, all things remaining constant. But there's no dark hand in the Electoral Commission that seeks to turn things towards one way or another. But sometimes opposition parties themselves must have an introspection about their expectations in their country. And I think in South Africa, it's a country that's actually about to have that conversation within itself.
Yeah.
How mature are the opposition parties? Is it okay to just say, get rid of the ANC as a message? And results might say no.
Yes. Now, Mr. Chokoza, it's not the first time actually you have claimed that the election was stolen. Some time back, the previous election again, of course, there were charges of fraud in the electoral process. Now, some have looked at powerful opposition leaders like yourself and said, perhaps learning from experience and understanding the power of the incumbency and its ability to manipulate things, why not first make sure you have the structures, the institutions that can guarantee those free and fair elections before you go into an election?
Well, we tried because after the 2014 election, there were consultations with regard to systems that needed to be improved. And several pieces of legislation were suggested that they come through Parliament. And this present administration shut them down. They didn't want anything changed because they still wanted to have this advantage, which is not really good for the people of Malawi. Now, the administrative reforms that the Electoral Commission implemented were the ones that began to enable us to win, by elections throughout this term. And we were pretty confident that this would also happen at the, general election. Now, it didn't happen because they used some dirty tricks, like I just mentioned. You don't legitimize an election that uses TPEX to get an incumbent returned to power. That is unacceptable. It's a shame in all the world. You don't use that.
Now, in 2014, when you lost the election by about 448,000, you are willing to go back and, just endorse the person, or at least accept the results at that time for the sake of peace. And some may say, what is different this time?
What is different this time is that really, for the sake of peace, you cannot sell justice at the altar of the same, because peace is not just the absence of war. What had happened then was, let's give them a chance. But 5 years went by, and government services were no longer what they used to be. And so everybody in the country said, no, this system has to change, and this administration has to go. And so this is the reason that we believe now it's no longer a case of just saying, let everything go by. We have to fight this for the sake of Malawians that are continuing to suffer today, because there's a whole lot of looting that has continued on and corruption that this government has left unattended to. And so, no, this time it is different. The whole nation actually is angry as we speak because of fraudulent elections such as we've seen.
But it's still, Mr. President Mutharika won with this, significant number. I mean, you, of course, don't accept that he beat you. But do you also acknowledge that he got a substantial vote which represents the people of Malawi, and therefore he has done something that kind of impresses some of the Malawians?
Until the courts determine this, I'm not, willing to accept the premise. But for sure, certain segments of this country appreciate him. I'm just saying the majority do not. Even if you look at this particular election, you will see that most people didn't vote for him.
Yes. Now, let's assume this election is nullified by the courts, which means President Mutharika has to literally get back out of State House and go back to the drawing board. What would you expect? Who, again, is going to run this election? How is the election? How can you guarantee that you can get a different result if the elections are held by the same electoral commission, by the same system?
I have faith in what we already have as rules governing elections in this country. This particular commission has proved to the world and to Malawians that they cannot honestly and justly run an election if this is truly what happened. And so I know that the systems will be in place, and the courts will give direction as to what needs to happen. And I have every confidence that every system working and every institution working without any hindrance from any quarter, they should be able to advise us as to what to do next.
Yes. Now, Dr. Mnyandu, people have looked at South Africa, and lately I've seen that there's a kind of excitement around parties like, especially the EFF, the Economic Freedom Party, Freedom Front. Now, they seem to have an agenda that seems to kind of bring some excitement among a cross-section of South Africans, especially the youth. But still, they're not anywhere closer to getting to the kind of support ANC has. What is it about ANC that makes it still that popular, regardless of the fact that many people feel they have not managed to resolve so many of the issues that were the reason for fighting for liberation, the reason why Mandela went to prison for so many years?
And I think it goes back to, sometimes we, as analysts, we've overestimated the extent to which South Africans are actually a radical people. Regardless, sometimes we see quite radical actions in South Africa. Sometimes we see acts of xenophobia. Sometimes we see, and South Africa can be quite a violent country. But South Africans, when it comes to politics and political parties, they're quite a patient people to a sin. So, and they understand that, they seem to understand, at least through their vote, that bringing socio-political change is going to be a process. Now, this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in the sense that the country remains stable and the people have the electorate has a mature outlook on things. However, it's bad when you would like a change on corruption. It's bad when you would like a quicker implementation. It's bad when you would like there to be a quicker elimination of what we call the bucket system, a very inhumane way whereby children in rural schools go to the bathroom using a bucket till this day in a very rich country. So that's why I always say South Africans are patient to a fault, sometimes their own fault.
And they say, some analysts say that this election, the past election was pretty much about corruption, inequality, and the generational divide rather, between those who were born and lived through apartheid and those who were born after, the freeborn.
That's right.
But how come that still the many South Africans are willing to forgive ANC, which has been accused of massive corruption, including the previous president, Jacob Zuma, had to get out because of corruption. And also the fact that so many people, I've been to places like Soweto. One gentleman told me something that really stung. He told me things were better during apartheid. That was in Soweto. I'm walking down the street and he said, things are so bad now that I miss apartheid. How is it that they can forgive and continue voting for ANC?
I would say it's because, let's look at the two major or dominant opposition parties. In fact, let's put facts there. Of the parties that participated in the election in South Africa, only 5 parties got more than 1%. So South African political game is an elite big boy or big girl game to begin with. And so the ANC gets 57%, then the DA comes, less than 20%, then the Economic Freedom Fighters. So if you're looking at it as far as maturity of the political system, the growth of parties like EFF might be an optimistic event. However, there's another party that came right after. It's called the Freedom Front Party. It's a white nationalist party. It used to be marginal. It used to get votes it used to get no more than about 4 MPs in parliament. Now it's going to get about 10. And that vote came from the second largest political opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. So there is a body of opinion then that says, look, South Africa, in a way, the opposition parties are retreating to the polar positions. And for a country like South Africa, that means ultimately and unfortunately along the lines of race when it comes to opposition parties.
Okay. Let me go back to Malawi. Mr. Chokoza, you know, among the things that are cited as advantages of the incumbency are things like the ability of the incumbency to manipulate the voters. There's that politics of clientism where those in power and position can actually influence the voters by doling out a few goodies. And also, of course, there's all the question of the ability to mobilize using government resources. Now, from what you're saying, you are not concerned about that. You're more concerned about something else. You don't think this was a reason why you lost, the manipulation of the voter, or perhaps the voter the voters literally selling out their ballots. But you are concerned about something else. What is it?
Well, you know, while it is true on one hand that the levels of poverty make it so easy for voters to be manipulated by handouts and easily manipulated because those in government or the incumbency tend to give them something when they need it. and they need it most. Or you have 20,000 teachers that get promoted. Was it 10,000 just before, a month before election, and these are returning officers. Or you have policemen, promoted, and you don't even have the lowest rank at all, because these are the people that will be manning polling stations and so forth. No, I believe Malawians have woken up to the fact that they know what they want, and the services that have not been forthcoming from duty bearers were such that they would not necessarily be, manipulated because of gifts they get during election. Most of them received the gifts. They knew it was their own taxes, but they said we will vote different, and they did.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mnyando, looking at the landscape in South Africa, would you say that, for example, the voting is not influenced so much by issues like poverty and wealth, or because South Africa is very complex also because of the racial mix and also the generational kind of rift we are talking about here. To what extent did such things as what the people perceive to be the gains they get from ANC as opposed to perhaps their judgment of what ANC hasn't done, how did this come into play during this past election?
I think it did to the extent that the people were aware, and they were quite vocal, often to the point of violent protests in the lead up to the elections. There were people burning ANC councillors' houses. ANC mayors were under extreme amounts of pressure from that very electorate. So at a local level, the South African people were quite keen to see change and to hold the feet of the ANC politicians to the fire. Yeah. However, this apparently was not enough to replace their abiding trust in the ANC, or let's just even say a resort to the ANC. What this tells us then is that we still have a weak opposition party system in South Africa. So this should, instead of looking towards the ANC, perhaps this is a time for an introspection on the part of the opposition parties.
Yeah. And Mr. Chokoza, the MCP, of course, is powerful. You've done well, obviously. But some have also opined that perhaps if the opposition was to combine force in Malawi, then, of course, the government will have or the incumbent will not have had any chance at all, given the kind of votes you personally garnered from your own party.
Well, while that is true, you must also respect the fact that in democracy, people cannot be forced to join forces because they have their own agendas. We tried, and I can tell you that there are those that endorsed me and pulled out of the race, particularly because they felt I was the best candidate to unite the country and to fight corruption and to follow the rule of law, and to be able to create an environment in which growth, economic growth, genuine growth takes place so that we experience transformation. And the lack of services in hospitals, in, standards in schools, even construction standards going down, were going to be different. And so they believed in what I was able to represent, and that's the reason they voted despite all of that difference, because I had a president running, his vice president running, and his minister running. And I still was able to garner support across the country, despite the fact that the three of them were part and parcel of the last administration.
Well, let's take a quick break here. You're tuned in to Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of our discussion in a moment.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about,
sharing stories of development and growth across Africa, around the world, and in our lives. Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
with me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number is 202-619-3111 and the U.S. country code is 1. Call us direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to turn down the volume on your radio or television and keep your comments brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Well, we appreciate all of the audience feedback. Remember, Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. You can watch our show there and leave a comment. Now let's look at what's on tap for next week's program.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, the CEOs of Kenya and South Africa and Airways have announced their resignations. Does this signal a lack of progress for African airlines? How profitable is Africa's aviation industry? Africa's airline woes on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Well, today we are discussing the power of incumbency in African elections. Our guests are Lazarus Chokoza, Malawian main opposition leader, Paul Nantulia, researcher at National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and Piwokunle Nyando at the Department of African Studies at Howard University. Once again, welcome. And thank you, Paul, for making it. You are around the building,
so
absolutely. We're happy to have you in the studio. Let me now then turn to you. You observed the elections in South Africa, and you've observed the elections in Malawi. You're very intimately kind of connected to electoral processes in Africa. What did you make of the power of incumbency in both of these elections? Or is it entirely true that the incumbency was a major factor in those elections?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's great to be back again. The power of incumbency in African elections is critical. It's very critical in terms of the control of the security sector, which is very important because the security sector is involved in elections, in securing the polling stations and so on. And when you have a situation such as Malawi, where the security sector is highly politicized, it always leads to charges of an unbalanced electoral environment. You have the control of the state media, and the state media is usually the most extensive. It penetrates throughout the country, and so you also have that aspect. You also have essentially control of the instruments of state, access to resources, to finance, which more often than not tends to favor the ruling party or the regime. But the key difference with South Africa, and we saw this in Malawi with the complaints, of the irregularities, and some of the election observers talked about that. Yeah. But with the situation in South Africa, you do have a history of very robust civic engagement. The South African civil society is very strong. It's very agile. It's very informed. It's highly sophisticated. It engages on issues of democracy, governance, electoral responsibility. So South Africa is different in that sense, that the population at large, through civic structures and also through the opposition parties, weak as they may be, have been able to get some serious, apply some serious pressure on the political parties. We've seen them engaging on issues of state capture. They played a very important role in the ultimate removal of Jacob Zuma, and they're trying to keep the ANC on its toes, and they do have mechanisms through which that is done. So I would say that South Africa is different in the sense that you have a very robust and very experienced and sophisticated civil society.
Would you also say that the incumbency does not have the capacity to suppress the smaller opposition parties or even other entities?
Not as much as you would find in other places. Yes. Not as much. I mean, there is a history, there's a tradition, which is very unique and very specific to the South African case. Of course, the ANC has its roots in that, and right now there's a battle going on within the party with regard to whether it should, stick, to the roots that it has been known for and it has been celebrated for on the African continent and the rest of the world, or whether it will just evolve into just another incumbent, deeply entrenched political party on the continent.
Yes. Mr. Chokoza, going back to Malawi now, we saw that some of the accusations were about some election officials, in fact, manipulating the votes, committing what you considered fraud. Looking at the chain, would you say that perhaps some of these actions were not sanctioned by the people at the top, by the president himself? That perhaps these are some crooked fellows who perhaps have their personal, certain things to gain from having the system in place rather than have you come into power. What is your assessment?
Well, I would think that you're correct, partly because it's possible the president didn't sanction this. And in fact, if he learns that this is what happened, he may be shocked that he's been returned to power in ways that are illegitimate. But there are those who are really benefiting from the broken system. And so they would want the status quo to continue. And at the expense of millions of Malawians suffering in the villages because of lack of services in hospitals and the education system that has broken down. And so a few may want to do that, and they could have connived, I have no doubt, to do stuff like this. Because why would the MEC chair say that they did not sanction the use or the procurement of TPEX, and yet TPEX was all over the country? And the same MEC chair then says, we will accept these results. This is unacceptable. It is a shame. Malawi has had a chance to really prove to the world that democracy was being entrenched, and miserably we failed that.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Mnyando, in terms of the process itself, we saw in Malawi the person, and we'll come to Mr. Chokoza to comment on that, the inauguration of the president happened like the next day after there had been this, dispute over the election results.
But
yes,
but not the choosing of the swearing in of the deputy president.
Yes,
which tells you about a serious schism, which tells you that Ramaphosa is still a lame duck in some way within the ANC, which tells you that the ANC power structures are still a draw, which tells you that the ANC, within the ANC, Ramaphosa still has not consolidated his power, you see, because Mr. Mabuza, who's currently the deputy president, who was Ramaphosa's deputy president, who was the chair of the African National Congress in the all-powerful Mpumalanga province, without which you cannot run the ANC and, by extension, South Africa. It's always Mpumalanga or KwaZulu-Natal. He was the one that delivered Mpumalanga and delivered Ramaphosa's presidency. So there were rumors that he might not be picked to be a deputy president, because in some circles he's compromised.
Yes.
And he then said, well, let me be cleared first and let me be investigated, which was a gambit that actually worked towards his advantage, because Ramaphosa, sensing danger, quickly had him sworn in. So Ramaphosa has headwinds that he has to look for. Not far in South Africa, as like all the struggles within the South African polity, they take place within the ANC.
Yeah. Now, Paul, some will tell you that incumbency has advantages anywhere in the world, even in the United States, right from the congressional elections to the presidency. What makes the incumbency in Africa particularly different in terms of how they use the power of incumbency, and why does it become so destructive in some countries to the extent that we have had even civil wars?
There are three main factors, and I agree with that statement. You have incumbency everywhere. You have benefits of incumbency. But there are three factors on the African continent. The first is the institutions that are supposed to check the presidency, supposed to check the executive, supposed to establish rule of law and accountability, are very weak, and they're deliberately compromised and weakened further by the executive. This is the first problem, and this is what we saw under the administration of Jacob Zuma, for instance, right? That is the first problem. The second problem is the tradition, the lots of incumbents on the African continent, with the exception of a few countries, have entrenched a tradition of winner-take-all, lack of accountability, impunity, right? We saw this with the state capture allegations in South Africa, but state capture exists in other African countries, right? So the abuse of public funds has effectively become part of the political culture in many of these countries. The third problem has to do with the security sector, right? The security sector plays an outsized role in the politics of many African countries, and that enables you to to manipulate processes. The security sector is abused, and by security sector we're talking police, we're talking intelligence, we're talking the military. So these three factors are hugely problematic on the African continent and are really critical in the ability of incumbents to entrench themselves and sustain themselves in office.
Which makes every election cycle almost look similar to the previous one in most of the countries, and actually, except for South Africa, I think we go through all this anxiety in every African country. Correct. Mr. Chokoza, as a person who's going through that, who has gone through elections in Malawi 2014, literally nearly won the election, even without any stealing, hopefully, then you still came very close to that. Now, what would change in Malawi so that that advantage of incumbency doesn't become such a negative force? Because some have said one of the problems of African countries is that they're actually semi-authoritarian. They are not fully democratic, and they're not exactly authoritarian. They're kind of oscillating in between there, and that makes the incumbent have so much influence, so much power, and so much advantage. What can you do in Malawi to make sure things change in the next cycle of election?
In fact, we proposed such changes that would make our democracy a lot more practical and serving the needs of the people. Institutions that are meant to be checking on the presidency, the executive, governance institutions need to be strengthened, and they need to have not just the budget they need, they also need to have the independence operatively, because many of them, because they get appointed by the president, they don't want to burn, the finger that bite the finger that feeds them, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So we proposed that we would make these governance institutions strong in themselves, and that impunity should go. A president needs to be answerable to the people. Transparency and accountability should be entrenched, and the presidency needs to be that which gives the example to all of the other institutions. And, we are preaching professionalism. We want government institutions, the military, to be professional, not to be politicized. The police and even the intelligence organs, they shouldn't be, political witch hunters. Yeah. They ought to really look at security issues that's good for the nation. These things need to be addressed, and we had proposals in our manifesto that would address this. We want to break this cycle where, Africa, we should have this narrative all the time. It's time that we started a new chapter. Mm-hmm. And so what is happening in this country now is really a precursor to a rebirth of a nation 60 years after we first fought for independence from the British.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Mnyando, most of our viewers who sometimes communicate with me say, well, you're talking about the same things over and over. The conversation we're having right now, we probably have had it in similar programs 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Question is, really, what will it take? I mean, it's okay to say this is what should happen. We should have a change of, the way the government relates with the people, the way the institutions are structured. What will it take? Because it doesn't seem like anything is happening in over 50 African countries.
Mm-hmm. I'd say in South Africa doesn't need heroes. It needs ideas. Because a pessimistic view, of course, of, for example, of Mr. Ramaphosa would be that how can he be a new dawn, as he had said, he would be when he has been a deputy president of the country in charge of government business for all of Zuma's terms, right? So that's a pessimistic view. But an optimistic view would answer your question by saying, well, it will take a growth in the opposition parties. And on that point, we have reasons to be optimistic. For the first time, I think the third largest opposition party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, has won across the board. This is important for next elections because in South Africa, most opposition parties died by succumbing to regionalism. COPE became regionalistic. In other words, it gets associated with the same region and by extension as a tribe, a particular tribe. IFP, KwaZulu-Natal, COPE, Eastern Cape, PAC, Eastern Cape, and so on and so forth. But the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by a non-Zulu, a Pedi man from Limpopo province, was able to be the second largest political party in 2 provinces and the third largest in almost all of them, including, most importantly, KwaZulu-Natal, which is known for its quite regional bent when it chooses leaders. So this party has actually been able to have a presence throughout all provinces. And so I think it will take that. And yes.
Yeah, but Paul, naturally here, look, opposition parties, when they get to power, they become the ruling party. And the opposition party, the former ruling party, as Mr. Chokoza will tell you, becomes the opposition party. And then we see that once they get into power, they actually start enjoying the perks of being a ruling party, and they don't have the appetite to make the changes that they fought for. So what would it take? I mean, it's not enough for an opposition party to get into power to see this transformation in Africa. What is it that Africans could do to just make sure that whatever party is in power will make these changes so that the future elections can be free, fair, and acceptable?
Right. Now, it's not going to come immediately, but it is a progression. You know, at the beginning of this particular section, you talked about, you know, the fact that we're always talking about the same things. I think we need to continue talking about these things until we get to where we want to go. Right? So it's very, very important that we keep focused on this. But I think fundamentally, the other issue is none of these political organizations really has the will to change the structure of the political process in Africa. And that's why you have liberation movements that come into office with reformist ideas, but after 5, 6, 10 years, they become entrenched and they begin to be accused of the same things that they complained about when they were in the opposition. And that's because they're not incentivized to change the structure. So that's the first thing that we need to do. We really need to revisit the structural foundations of how politics and how political power is exercised on the African continent. That's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is we need to pay attention to the youth demographic and the youth bulge. You know, countries like Uganda, countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, right? Malawi, you know, we would have loved to have seen, you know, 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds contest seriously for office. What Julius Malema in South Africa has done, for instance, is an example of this demographic shift. And it's extremely important because that is where the bulk of the voting population is. And this is really where the struggle to change the continent, to institute a democratic culture. If you look at the protests that took place, that have been taking place in South Africa consistently, 90% of it is constituted by that particular class.
Isn't it true also that actually power corrupts, and it can corrupt even the youth? We have seen young people in positions of power who ended up being as corrupt as their predecessors, as corrupt as the older people that were holding those positions. Correct. Is it all about the age, or is it about the institutions that can check anybody who is in position of power so that they do not abuse their power?
Right. I think it's both. I think it's both. I think it's both. And I think you need a different vision. I think you need a different program. I think you need different sets of leaderships. Because everything that African citizens have seemingly done or seemingly supported since independence doesn't seem to have worked.
Yes.
Right?
Now, let me, Mr. Chokoza,
Yes.
well, I know you're still a young man, but what's your take on that? The fact that perhaps if you had more youth involved in the processes, if you had more youth coming into positions of power, there could be a different flavor, different vision, and perhaps the continent would move forward a bit differently, including Malawi.
I believe that. I believe that in issues of leadership, we should not just look at structures. The structures are extremely important, but even the best constitutions and the best policies fail to work because of people that implement the same. And if they do not have, like it has been said, do not have the political will and the continued political will to pull through with what they promise to deliver to people, then everything falls apart. And so we do need to address issues of character in leadership. We do need to address issues that have to do with consistency and the ability to serve people and to serve people on a consistent basis so that you do not become your own bosses and serve your own needs. The Malawian people are people that understand these things now, and they want to see a different type of leadership. And this is the reason that the young people, despite the fact that I'm a little older than most of them, have rallied behind me like you can't believe. We have a youth movement across the country that, you cannot believe that is following Malawi Congress Party. But the reason is I stand for young people and their empowerment and the ability that we have demonstrated, even in our services elsewhere, that this is what we believe in. This demographic dividend needs to be utilized to the utmost, but needs to be directed so the power is channeled right. And when that becomes the most productive sector, Malawi will rise and become totally different from what it is now.
Yes. Dr. Mnyandu, some have also said, well, perhaps one of the things that make people want to hold on to power and perhaps manipulate the system so that they can continue staying is because in African politics, the politicians have access, unfettered access to resources. They can engage in corrupt activities and get away with it. Would that perhaps be the most important thing to target, to make it so difficult for people to enrich themselves through holding political office, such that people would not necessarily think of that place as a place you go and you want to stay on, rather be a place where you go to serve, such that after some time you get kind of tired and you want to retire?
Yes, I would say it's quite difficult in the case of South Africa because these are many of the politicians do not have careers other than they're not lawyers, or if they are, they never practiced. So these are not people these are people that are easily displaced professionally and financially. So the triplets then of corruption in the context of South Africa, nepotism, cronyism, and all these things that come into play, or patronage, the third one, they rear their ugly heads. So I would say a solution to that would be, we're looking at the wrong place when we're looking at the government. It's too late. We're supposed to look at the ANC itself, how political parties elect our leaders, because the person that rules the ANC, or the top 6, or the top 32, which is the executive committee, runs the country. There's a committee in the ANC, it's called the Deployment Committee. Who becomes a minister in South Africa is not decided necessarily by the president, but by the Deployment Committee. We don't know who chairs that committee. And so if there were processes to check such committees, it would be a fait accompli by the time, it would be a fait accompli as far as clean governance by the time elections come, because we know that the ANC has an in-house cleaning mechanism. And I cannot say that I have confidence that it exists right now.
Yeah, the cleaning brooms have to be clean in order to ensure the room is clean itself. So that's another question. Paul, in that particular question, I really want you to also chime in on this fact that, whether it's in Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania or whatever, a politician is guaranteed wealth because of access. Not so much in Tanzania now anymore, but in many countries. So this makes people want to stay on in power because first they enjoy the impunity of holding those positions, but the access. So is that perhaps the key
I think it is, and I think this is the worry that, the worry that I have about South Africa is that there had always been a hope that given the ANC's traditions and the ANC's origins, that it would go a different way. But under Jacob Zuma, we saw that the ANC is as vulnerable as any other political organization on the continent to this vice of corruption, and actually very, very sophisticated. It's more than just petty corruption. This is grand corruption on a massive scale. Now, I agree with Poor that we need to look at the political organizations themselves, and we need to look at their internal mechanisms. And it's true that the ANC does have checks and balances. Now, every time that the ANC has gotten rid of a leader, it has been through an internal process. Now, yes, it's true that there's been outside pressure, but Thabo Mbeki, we saw what happened with Thabo Mbeki. We saw what happened with Jacob Zuma. But I would argue that those institutions have been weakened. Look at the Integrity Commission. They stopped David Mabuza from being sworn in, and an alternative had actually been lined up. But within a week, he was able to push the argument that he questioned their investigative authority, and he now sits as deputy president. In Swahili, there's a term, sanduku, which means briefcase. Yeah. And I like to use the term sanduku politics. If your objective as a politician is to look at the state as a briefcase, where all you're doing is basically amassing goodies, right? Then the whole political process, it becomes, it's so contested. We need to decongest the political system. We need to decongest State House and make it less lucrative.
Exactly. Now, Mr. Chakwera, I know, of course, if you become president, or if they overturn the results, you become president, or perhaps later on you contest and win the election. What would you do first to make sure that yourself, you'll be checked by the system so that you don't abuse your power, but that you can create a system in Malawi that will guarantee the future of that country is brighter because of the structures that you've put in place?
First of all, I want to be answerable to the people. I'll be going to Parliament to answer questions and to be interrogated. I want to be answerable to members of civil society organizations, to the media. I want to be answerable to institutions, governance institutions, that are able to prop me and show me that what I do is not right. And I have told Malawian people that I would be willing to face the law because I stand for rule of law, and I want everyone to be able to do the same. I do not want to enrich myself. I want to serve Malawians. And I want to introduce this servant leadership as a new type of leadership that delivers services to people, not just serve our own stomachs. I do not believe that Malawi should continue with the present system, because the present system does, in fact, make it so like you want to go into politics to enrich yourself, to profit by it. And I said, no, we must be servants. We must look at what the people need. And that's why my message has been so well received across the country, because I have become the mouthpiece of many suffering Malawians.
Well, we wish you all the best, and I think that's a good place to conclude our conversation today. Thank you very much. And so, on that note, our guest today have been Lazarus Chokoza, Paul Lantulia, and Piokunle Mnyando. I want to thank our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa, and from all of us here in Washington, have a good night.
Email at africatv@voanews.com.
So,
Log on to our website at voaafrica.com.